Take the pretty one, her father offered the Duke, but he looked at the rejected sister in the shadows. The Duke was supposed to marry her sister. Instead, he turned his gaze to her, the rejected one, standing in the shadows. What did he see in the invisible sister that everyone else missed? Hello, lovely. If you're enjoying this historic romantic tale, I'd be so grateful for a like or a subscribe. It helps me bring you more stories of love, longing, and history. And if you're up for it, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every note, and it always brings a smile to my face. Chapter 1. The Invisible Daughter. The afternoon light slanted through the library windows in pale golden streams, illuminating dancing motes of dust that drifted like tiny spirits through the still air. Lady Isabel Blackwood sat curled in the worn leather chair by the eastern window, her favorite perch in all of Blackwood Manor, with John Locke's An Essay Concerning Human Understanding open in her lap. The pages were soft beneath her fingers, edges rounded from years of handling, the leather binding cracked but comfortable in her hands like an old friend's embrace. She had just reached Locke's assertion that the mind was a blank slate tabula rasa upon which experience wrote its lessons, when the sound of carriage wheels on gravel shattered the library's peaceful silence. "She's returned. Lady Amelia has returned." The housemaid's excited cry echoed through the manor's stone corridors, followed by the rapid patter of feet. Isabel looked up from her book, marking her place with a finger, and listened as the household stirred to life with an energy it rarely possessed these days. Doors opened and closed, voices rose in cheerful greeting. Even Mrs. Hartwell, their aging housekeeper, could be heard hurrying down the main staircase with uncharacteristic speed. Isabel remained in her chair, watching the dust motes continue their lazy dance, undisturbed by the commotion beyond the library doors. Her sister had been to the modiste in London, a 2-day journey that had consumed the household's conversation for the past week. New gowns for the season, the finest silks, colors that would complement Amelia's golden hair and rose-petal complexion. Isabel had heard it all discussed in exhaustive detail, though no one had thought to ask if she might need new gowns as well. Not that it mattered. Isabel had long ago accepted her role in the family tableau, the shadow to Amelia's light, the footnote to her sister's story. She returned her attention to Locke, but the words blurred before her eyes. Through the library's half-open door, she could hear her sister's voice, bright and musical, like bells chiming. "Oh, Mrs. Hartwell, you should see the emerald silk. The modiste said it would make my eyes look like precious gems, and the cream muslin with the embroidered roses. Father will adore it, I'm certain." "I'm sure you'll be the belle of every ball, my lady," Mrs. Hartwell replied, her voice warm with genuine affection. Isabel closed her book quietly and rose from her chair, moving to the window that overlooked the manor's front courtyard. Below, servants were unloading trunk after trunk from the carriage, each presumably filled with finery that would make Amelia even more dazzling than nature had already rendered her. Lady Amelia Blackwood stood in the center of the activity like a sun around which planets orbited, her golden hair catching the autumn light, her face animated with excitement. She was beautiful, there was no denying it. Society had proclaimed it since her debut 3 years ago, and the proclamation had only grown louder with time. Perfect features, perfect bearing, perfect charm. Isabel turned away from the window and caught her own reflection in the small mirror that hung beside the bookshelf. Dark hair pulled back simply, grey eyes that were too large for her face, features that were pleasant enough but utterly unremarkable. She was not ugly, precisely, but she was not Amelia. And in the world they inhabited, that single fact defined everything. The library door burst open, and Amelia swept in, still wearing her traveling cloak, her cheeks flushed from the journey. "Isabel, there you are. I should have known I'd find you buried in books." Her tone was affectionate, without malice, which somehow made it worse. "Welcome home," Isabel said, managing a genuine smile. Whatever complicated feelings she harbored about her sister, she did love her. It was impossible not to love Amelia, who had never been cruel, never been unkind, but who simply existed in a different sphere entirely. "You must come see the gowns," Amelia insisted, crossing to take Isabel's hands. "The modiste has outdone herself this time. There's a blue one that I think would suit you wonderfully. I had her make it up in your size. It will need altering, of course, but—" "That was thoughtful," Isabel interrupted gently, squeezing her sister's hands. "Thank you." Amelia's expression flickered with something guilt, perhaps, or pity, but it passed quickly. replaced by her usual bright enthusiasm. "Come then. I want your opinion on how I should wear my hair for the season's first balls." Isabel followed her sister from the library, leaving Locke behind on the chair. The manor's corridors, which had seemed so peaceful moments ago, now thrummed with energy centered entirely on Emilia's return. They passed two maids carrying hat boxes, both of whom curtsied to Emilia and looked straight through Isabel as though she were merely part of the wallpaper. She was used to it. The late afternoon found Isabel in the small parlor adjacent to her father's study, ostensibly reading but actually seeking the quiet warmth of the fire. The early autumn chill had crept into the manor's bones, and funds for extra coal were scarce, though no one spoke of such things openly. The sound of raised voices filtered through the study door. 6 months, my lord. Perhaps less if your creditors grow impatient." Isabel recognized Mr. Pembroke's voice, the family solicitor, whose visits had become increasingly frequent and increasingly grim over the past year. "There must be something," her father replied, his usually authoritative voice tight with desperation. "The estate, surely. The estate is mortgaged to the hilt, my lord. You've borrowed against every acre, every asset. Unless you find a substantial infusion of capital, you will lose everything. The title will remain, but the manor, the lands, the income, all of it will be forfeit." A heavy silence followed. Isabel sat frozen in her chair, the book forgotten in her lap, her heart pounding. "Then Emilia must marry well," Lord Blackwood said finally, his voice hard with resolve. And quickly, "Duke Edward Sinclair is seeking a wife, they say. He's been in mourning these 8 years, but rumor has it he's finally ready to marry. Emilia could be the answer to everything. His Grace is notoriously particular," Mr. Pembroke cautioned. "Many have tried to capture his attention. Emilia will succeed where others have failed. She must. Our entire future depends on it." Isabel's hands trembled slightly as she gripped her book. 6 months. Complete ruin. And Emilia, beautiful, charming Emilia, was to be the sacrifice that saved them all. The study door opened abruptly. Isabel barely had time to look down at her book, feigning absorption, as her father strode past the parlor entrance without so much as a glance in her direction. His face was set in hard lines, his mind clearly racing through calculations and schemes. He passed within 3 feet of where she sat and did not see her. Isabel exhaled slowly, the familiar ache of invisibility settling in her chest like a stone. Evening brought a return to the manor's usual rhythms. Dinner was a quiet affair. The family dining room felt too large for 3 people. The empty chairs, a reminder of better times when aunts and uncles and cousins had filled the house with noise and laughter. Lord Blackwood was distracted, speaking little, his gaze constantly drifting to Emilia as though seeing her anew, calculating her worth in the marriage market. Emilia chattered about London, the modiste, the ladies she'd encountered shopping. Her voice had that slightly performative quality it always carried at dinner, as though she were practicing for some larger stage. Isabel ate quietly, contributed little to the conversation, and was not missed when she excused herself before dessert. She found her way back to the library, to her chair by the window, now dark with night. Someone had lit a single candle on the side table, probably Mrs. Hartwell, who alone seemed to notice Isabel's habits and needs. She opened Locke again, but could not focus on the philosophy. Her mind kept returning to the overheard conversation, to her father's desperate words, to the impossible weight now resting on Emilia's slender shoulders. Emilia must marry well. Not Isabel. Never Isabel. The thought had never even crossed Lord Blackwood's mind that his younger daughter might be of use in solving the family's crisis. She was simply too inconsequential, too easily forgotten. Isabel had spent 22 years as a shadow in her own home, drifting through rooms without causing a ripple, existing in the margins of her family's story. She loved them, she loved her father despite his blindness, loved Emilia despite the complicated tangle of affection and envy that bound them together. But the loneliness of perpetual invisibility had carved a hollow space inside her that no amount of books could fill. The sound of hoofbeats on gravel drew her attention to the window. A messenger on horseback, riding fast, despite the darkness. She watched as he dismounted at the entrance, watched as a footman took an envelope from him. Moments later, Emilia's delighted cry echoed through the manor. "Father! Father, come quickly! An invitation!" from Duke Edward Sinclair himself. Isabel remained in her library chair, listening to the excited voices in the distance, knowing without being told that her name would be included on the invitation only as an afterthought, a necessary formality. Lady Amelia Blackwood and family were invited to a grand ball at the Duke's estate. The trap was set, the game had begun, and Isabel, as always, would watch from the shadows while her sister stepped into the light. She looked down at the book in her lap, at Locke's careful reasoning about the nature of human understanding, and felt the weight of a truth the philosopher had never addressed, that understanding oneself, seeing one's own worth, meant nothing if the world had already decided you were invisible. The candle flickered in a draught, casting dancing shadows across the page. Outside her library sanctuary, Blackwood Manor hummed with new energy, new hope, all of it centered on Amelia's golden beauty and the Duke who might save them all. And Isabel, alone with her books and her thoughts, allowed herself one moment of selfish longing, wondering what it might feel like to be seen, truly seen, by someone who looked past the surface to the person beneath. Then she closed her book, extinguished her candle, and disappeared into the darkness of the manor's corridors, a ghost in her own home. Chapter 2. The Arrangement. The week that followed the Duke's invitation transformed Blackwood Manor into a hive of frenzied activity. Seamstresses arrived at dawn and worked by candlelight into the evening, their needles flashing as they adjusted hems and took in seams. The scent of lavender sachets mixed with the sharper smell of new fabric, and everywhere Isabel turned, she encountered bolts of silk, scattered pins, and harried servants rushing from room to room, all of it centered on Amelia. The morning room had been converted into a fitting chamber, where Amelia stood on a raised platform like a statue being sculpted, turning this way and that as Madame Devereux, the modiste, fussed over the drape of emerald silk. "The neckline must be perfect, my lady," Madame Devereux muttered through a mouthful of pins. "His Grace will notice every detail." Isabel watched from the doorway, unnoticed as usual, as her sister stood perfectly still, her arms extended while two assistants adjusted the sleeves. Amelia's face was serene, almost blank the expression she wore when she retreated into herself, becoming the beautiful object everyone required her to be. "Lady Isabel?" Isabel turned to find Madame Devereux's youngest assistant, a girl barely 16, holding a dress of pale grey muslin. "For you, my lady." "For the fitting." The dress was simple, almost severe in its lack of ornamentation. Isabel recognized it as the afterthought. It was made up quickly from leftover fabric, designed to ensure she would blend seamlessly into the wallpaper of whatever ballroom she occupied. The fitting took less than 10 minutes. No one fussed over the drape of her hem or worried whether the neckline flattered her complexion. The assistant marked a few adjustments with chalk, nodded, and moved on to more important tasks. Isabel caught her reflection in the standing mirror as she changed back into her day dress. In the grey gown, she looked like a ghost, pale, insubstantial, easily overlooked, which was, she supposed, exactly the point. Lord Blackwood had converted his study into a training ground of sorts. Isabel passed by one afternoon to find him coaching Amelia on the art of conversation, pacing before her like a general preparing his troops for battle. "You must be charming, but not forward, interested, but not desperate. You must laugh at his jests, but not too loudly. You must—" "Father, please," Amelia interrupted, a rare edge to her voice. "I understand what is required. Do you?" Lord Blackwood stopped his pacing, fixing his elder daughter with an intense stare. "Do you truly understand what hangs in the balance? You are the solution to all our problems, my dear. The Duke is our salvation. You cannot, you must not fail us." Isabel, standing unnoticed in the doorway, watched her sister's shoulders tighten, watched the way Amelia's hands clenched in her lap before she forced them to relax, to settle gracefully, perfectly. "I will not fail you, father," Amelia said quietly, her voice stripped of its usual music. Lord Blackwood nodded, satisfied, and returned to his pacing, listing all the ways Amelia must present herself to capture a duke's attention. Isabel slipped away before either of them noticed her presence. The weight of expectation settling over Amelia was almost visible, like dust accumulating on a shelf, layer upon layer until the original surface disappeared beneath it. That night, Isabel was reading by candlelight in her chamber when a soft knock sounded at her door. "Come in," she called, surprised. No one knocked at her door after dark. Amelia entered, still in her dressing gown, her golden hair loose around her shoulders. In the flickering candlelight, she looked younger, less polished, almost fragile. "I couldn't sleep," Amelia said, hovering near the door as though uncertain of her welcome. Isabel set aside her book and gestured to the chair beside her bed. "Sit with me." Amelia crossed the room and sank into the chair, drawing her knees up beneath her like a child seeking comfort. For a long moment, neither sister spoke. "Do you ever feel like a thing rather than a person?" Amelia asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Isabel's breath caught. It was the most honest question her sister had ever asked her. "Yes," Isabel answered simply. "Every day." Amelia looked at her then, really looked at her, and Isabel saw something raw and desperate in her sister's eyes. But before Isabel could reach out, before she could offer comfort or solidarity, Amelia's expression shuttered. The mask slipped back into place, beautiful, serene, untouchable. "I should let you sleep," Amelia said, rising abruptly. "The week ahead will be exhausting." She was gone before Isabel could find words to call her back, leaving only the faint scent of rosewater and the echo of a vulnerability too frightening to examine. Isabel stared at the closed door for a long time before returning to her book, though the words swam meaninglessly before her eyes. The library became Isabel's refuge from the chaos consuming the manor. While seamstresses sewed and dancing masters taught Amelia the latest steps, Isabel buried herself in research. She told herself she was simply curious, but truthfully, she was starving for any scrap of information about the man who had become the center of their household's desperate hopes, Duke Edward Sinclair. The name appeared in various books and periodicals scattered throughout her father's collection. She pieced together a portrait from fragments. Born in 1806, inherited the dukedom at 23 when his father died suddenly. By all accounts, a serious young man, scholarly, with progressive views that occasionally raised eyebrows among the more conservative members of the peerage. And then, the tragedy that had defined him. 8 years ago, the woman he loved, Lady Catherine Hartley, had died in a riding accident. The Duke had retreated from society, becoming something of a recluse, managing his estates with capable efficiency, but attending no balls, hosting no parties, living in what the gossip columns called splendid isolation. Until now. Until he had decided, finally, to seek a wife. Isabel found a political pamphlet tucked between two books on agricultural reform. She almost missed it, but the Duke's name on the cover caught her eye. On the Necessity of Educational Reform by Edward Sinclair, Duke of Ashworth. She opened it carefully and began to read. The arguments were cogent, passionate, radical. The Duke advocated for broader access to education, including, and Isabel's pulse quickened as she read Classical Education for Women. He quoted Mary Wollstonecraft. He argued that denying half the population access to learning was not only unjust but economically foolish. "A mind is not determined by the body that houses it," he wrote. "To assume women incapable of serious thought is to cripple our society with willful ignorance." Isabel read the pamphlet 3 times, committing whole passages to memory. Here was a man who believed women could think, could reason, could contribute to intellectual discourse. A man who saw minds rather than merely faces. She pressed the pamphlet to her chest and allowed herself a dangerous moment of longing. What would it be like to converse with such a man? To discuss philosophy, politics, ideas that mattered? To be seen not as an ornament or a disappointment, but as a thinking person worthy of engagement. The fantasy was foolish, she knew. The Duke would see what everyone else saw, beautiful Amelia, the obvious choice, the perfect Duchess. And Isabel would remain invisible, as always. She returned the pamphlet to its shelf and extinguished her candle, but sleep was long in coming. The day before the ball, Isabel found her father in the corridor, outside his study. She had a question about which wrap would be appropriate for evening, wear a small thing, hardly worth mentioning, but she had no one else to ask. "Father, might I?" "Not now, Isabel." Lord Blackwood waved her off without looking at her, his attention focused on the letter in his hand. Then, as though remembering something, he glanced up. "Actually, yes. Tomorrow evening, I need you to stay out of the way. This is Amelia's night. The Duke must see her clearly, without distraction. I need you to be invisible." The words were spoken casually, without malice or particular emphasis. He had already turned away before they finished leaving his mouth, disappearing into his study and closing the door. Isabel stood frozen in the corridor, her father's words echoing in her mind. "I need you to be invisible." It was nothing she hadn't heard before, in 1,000 small ways. But the casual cruelty of it, the unthinking dismissal, cut deeper than it should have. She pressed her palm against the wall to steady herself, willing away the sting of tears. She was already invisible, had been her entire life. Her father was merely acknowledging what everyone already knew. The evening before the ball, Isabel helped Emilia prepare for bed, brushing out her sister's golden hair in long, practiced strokes. Emilia sat before her vanity mirror, watching their reflections, one radiant, one ordinary, the contrast between them impossible to ignore. "You're quiet tonight," Emilia observed. "Tired," Isabel lied. The candlelight caught in Emilia's hair, turning each strand to spun gold. She was breathtaking, Isabel thought. Any man would be fortunate to win her. The Duke would take one look at this vision of beauty, and the matter would be settled. "Will you help me dress tomorrow?" Emilia asked. "I find I'm rather nervous." "Of course," Isabel said, managing a smile. "You'll be magnificent. The Duke won't be able to look away." Emilia's reflection smiled, but her eyes remained troubled. And what if that's all he sees? The surface? What if there's nothing beneath it that interests him? Isabel paused mid-stroke, surprised by the question. But before she could formulate an answer, Emilia shook her head, banishing the moment of vulnerability. "Never mind. Foolish thoughts before a ball. Help me with these pins." Isabel helped her sister prepare for bed, sorted her jewelry for the following evening, and wished her pleasant dreams. As she left Emilia's chamber and returned to her own, she carried with her a tangle of emotions too complex to name: love and envy, hope and resignation, compassion and the dull ache of knowing that tomorrow night she would watch from the shadows while her sister stepped into the light that might save them all. In her own chamber, she lay awake long into the night, thinking of a duke who believed women's minds mattered and wondering if such a man truly existed outside the pages of political pamphlets. Tomorrow, she would find out. Tomorrow, she would be invisible, as requested. And somewhere in the darkest hours before dawn, Isabel admitted to herself what she had been trying desperately to deny, that despite everything, despite logic and experience and 22 years of evidence to the contrary, a small, foolish part of her heart dared to hope. Chapter 3. The Duke's Gaze. The Duke's estate emerged from the twilight like something from a fairy story, all golden windows and elegant proportions, its classical facade illuminated by hundreds of torches that lined the sweeping drive. Isabel pressed closer to the carriage window, watching the great house grow larger as they approached, her stomach tight with apprehension. Beside her, Emilia sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her breathing carefully controlled. The emerald silk of her gown shimmered in the dim carriage light, and even in this confined space, she looked like a masterpiece painted by one of the great artists. Lord Blackwood, seated across from them, had not stopped talking since they left Blackwood Manor. "Remember," Emilia smiled, but not too broadly. "Laugh at his conversation, ask intelligent questions, but do not dominate the discussion." And Isabel. "I know, Father," Isabel said quietly. "I'll stay out of the way." He nodded, already dismissing her, his attention returning to Emilia. "This is our moment. Do not waste it." The carriage rolled to a stop. A liveried footman opened the door, and the sounds of the ball flooded in music, laughter, the murmur of society's elite gathering for an evening of careful performance and ruthless judgment. Emilia descended first, her movements graceful, practiced. Lord Blackwood followed, then turned to hand Isabel down as an afterthought. She stepped onto the gravel drive in her pale grey gown and felt herself disappear, becoming merely part of the background against which more important people would shine. The ballroom stole Isabel's breath, despite her determination to remain unmoved. Crystal chandeliers hung from a ceiling painted with elaborate frescoes, their countless candles reflected in gilt-edged mirrors that made the room seem infinite. The orchestra occupied a raised platform at the far end, their music weaving through the conversations of ladies in jewel-toned gowns and gentlemen in impeccable evening dress. The air smelled of hothouse flowers, expensive perfume, and beeswax candles. It was too much, too bright, too loud, too overwhelming. Isabel felt the urge to flee, warring with curiosity, as Lord Blackwood guided them through the crowd, accepting greetings from acquaintances while steering purposefully toward the receiving line. And there, at the center of it all, stood Duke Edward Sinclair. He was taller than Isabel had imagined, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell slightly over his forehead despite obvious attempts to tame it. Handsome, certainly, but it was not his features that arrested her attention. It was the quality of stillness about him, the sense of a man who had learned to armor himself against the world. Grief had etched faint lines around his eyes and mouth, lending his face a gravity that set him apart from the younger, more carelessly cheerful men surrounding him. He moved through the obligations of hosting with quiet dignity, greeting each guest with courtesy but without the affected charm of aristocratic performance. There was something almost weary about him, Isabel thought, as though he were going through expected motions while his thoughts remained elsewhere. "Your Grace." Lord Blackwood's voice rose above the general din as he positioned himself before the Duke, Emilia at his side like a prize being presented. "May I have the honor of presenting my daughter, the finest jewel in all of England, Lady Emilia Blackwood." Emilia curtsied perfectly, her golden hair catching the candlelight, her smile luminous. Isabel, standing slightly behind and to the side, watched the Duke's expression carefully. He bowed, said something appropriate, asked Emilia to dance. Society watched approvingly as the Duke led Emilia to the floor for a waltz. Lord Blackwood beamed with satisfaction. Isabel felt her heart sink with the inevitability of it all, beautiful Emilia and the handsome Duke, the perfect match, the expected outcome. She slipped away while her father's attention was focused on the dancing couple, moving through the crowd with the ease of someone accustomed to being overlooked. The press of bodies made her anxious, the noise overwhelming, and she found herself gravitating toward the quieter edge of the ballroom. A wall of floor-to-ceiling bookcases occupied one end of the room, a curious choice for a ballroom, but Isabel blessed whoever had designed it. She approached the shelves like a drowning person reaching for solid ground. The books were real, not merely decorative. She ran her fingers along the spines, finding comfort in their familiar solidity. Philosophy, political theory, poetry, a collection that spoke of genuine intellectual curiosity rather than mere status. Her hand stopped on a slim volume bound in dark blue leather. A Vindication of the Rights of Woman by Mary Wollstonecraft. Isabel pulled it from the shelf, her heart quickening. She had read it twice, had memorized whole passages, had found in Wollstonecraft's fierce arguments a validation of thoughts she'd barely dared articulate. To find it here, in a duke's ballroom, seemed almost miraculous. She opened it carefully, finding the dedication page, then the beginning of the introduction. The words were old friends, welcoming her home. Wollstonecraft, a bold choice for a ball. The voice came from directly beside her, low, cultured, tinged with something that might have been amusement. Isabel's head snapped up, the book nearly slipping from her hands. The Duke stood not 3 feet away, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "Your Grace, Isabel stammered, feeling heat flood her cheeks. "I apologize. I shouldn't have." "Why not?" he interrupted gently. "They're here to be read, not merely displayed." She stared at him, confusion warring with embarrassment. The dance had ended. He should be with Emilia, with her father, securing the arrangement everyone expected. Instead, he stood before Isabel in her invisible grey gown, looking at her as though she were actually worth seeing. "Have you read it?" he asked, nodding toward the book. "Yes," Isabel managed. "Twice. And what did you think?" The question was genuine, his attention fully focused on her in a way that made her feel exposed and strangely exhilarated. "I think," Isabel paused, gathering her thoughts, feeling herself slip into the familiar comfort of ideas rather than awkward social performance. "I think she argues persuasively that denying women education does not protect their virtue, but rather ensures their dependence. That treating women as decorative objects rather than thinking beings diminishes both the women themselves and the society that constrains them." The Duke's expression shifted, something lighting in his eyes that hadn't been there during his dance with Emilia. "You disagree with her critics, then? Those who claim she advocates for unwomanly behavior?" "Her critics confuse independence with impropriety," Isabel said, warming to the subject, forgetting her nervousness. "They cannot imagine a woman who thinks and remains virtuous, as though the two qualities were somehow incompatible. But surely virtue grounded in genuine understanding is stronger than virtue maintained through ignorance." For the first time since she'd observed him that evening, the Duke smiled, not the polite expression he'd worn while greeting guests, but something genuine, reaching his eyes and softening the grief-carved lines of his face. "Catherine used to carry that very volume," he said quietly. "She would quote whole passages at dinner parties, much to the horror of the more conventional guests." Catherine, Lady Catherine Hartley, the woman he'd loved and lost. "I'm sorry," Isabel said softly. "I didn't mean to. Please don't apologize." The Duke's voice was firm but not unkind. "It's been 8 years since anyone spoke to me about ideas rather than condolences. I find I've missed it." Isabel looked up at him, truly looked at him, and saw past the title and the tragedy to the person beneath, someone intelligent, weary of superficiality, hungry for genuine connection. "Your pamphlet on educational reform," she said before she could stop herself. "I read it. I thought your arguments about access to classical education were particularly compelling." His eyebrows rose. "You've read my pamphlet?" "I read everything I can find," Isabel admitted. "My father's library is limited, but I make do." "And what do you think of—" "Your Grace?" Lord Blackwood's voice cut through the moment like a blade. Isabel stepped back instinctively as her father materialized beside them, his expression hovering between confusion and alarm. Emilia stood slightly behind him, her perfect composure showing the first hairline cracks of uncertainty. "Forgive me, Your Grace," Lord Blackwood said, his smile strained. "My younger daughter has a habit of wandering. I hope she hasn't troubled you. Lady Emilia was just mentioning how much she enjoyed your dance." "Not at all," the Duke said, his tone courteous but distant. The warmth that had animated his face during conversation with Isabel had shuttered, replaced by the polite mask of aristocratic obligation. "Lady Isabel and I were discussing literature, a refreshing conversation." He turned back to Isabel, and for a moment their eyes met. Something passed between them, recognition, perhaps, or possibility, or the beginning of understanding. "I hope we might continue our discussion another time, Lady Isabel," he said quietly. Then he bowed, acknowledged Emilia and Lord Blackwood with appropriate courtesy, and moved away to greet other guests, leaving Isabel standing breathless and confused beside the bookcase. Lord Blackwood turned on her the moment the Duke was out of earshot. "What did you say to him?" he hissed. "You were supposed to stay invisible, not—" "I did nothing, Father," Isabel said, still holding Wollstonecraft's book. "He approached me. Well, see that it doesn't happen again. Emilia is the one he should be noticing." He took Emilia's arm and steered her away, already planning his next approach. Isabel remained by the bookcases, carefully returning the blue volume to its place on the shelf. Her hands trembled slightly. The Duke's words echoed in her mind. "I hope we might continue our discussion another time." Across the ballroom, she caught sight of him speaking with an elderly couple, performing his duties as host with quiet efficiency. But once, just once, his gaze swept back across the room and found her standing by the books. Their eyes met for a heartbeat. Then he looked away. Isabel pressed her palm against the bookshelf, steadying herself against the strange, electric feeling coursing through her. For the first time in her life, someone had looked at her, truly looked at her, and seen not an invisible shadow, but a person worth knowing. It was terrifying. It was wonderful. And Isabel had absolutely no idea what to do with it. Chapter 4. The Calling. The morning after the ball, Isabel woke to the sound of her father's voice echoing through the manor's corridors. "He's calling this afternoon. The Duke himself. Mrs. Hartwell, we must prepare the drawing-room immediately. Emilia, you must wear the cream muslin, no, the rose silk. It brings out your complexion." Isabel lay in bed, listening to the household erupt into joyful chaos, and tried to convince herself that the previous evening had meant nothing. The Duke had been polite. Curious, perhaps, but the conversation by the bookcase had been a momentary aberration, a brief distraction before he returned to the serious business of courting Emilia. That was the natural order of things. That was how the world worked. She rose and dressed in a simple morning gown of pale blue, then made her way to the breakfast room, where she found Emilia already seated, pushing eggs around her plate without eating. "Congratulations," Isabel said quietly, taking her seat. "Father seems certain the Duke is coming to declare himself." Emilia looked up, her expression unreadable. "Does he?" Before Isabel could respond, Lord Blackwood swept into the room, already dressed for receiving callers despite the early hour. "Emilia, you must eat something. You look pale." "Isabel." He paused, seeming to notice her for the first time. "Yes, well, you may join us in the drawing-room when the Duke arrives. It would be odd if you weren't present." How generous, Isabel thought, but kept the bitterness from her face. The Duke arrived precisely at 3 o'clock, as proper calling hours dictated. Isabel sat in the corner of the drawing-room, a book open in her lap that she wasn't reading, while Emilia occupied the place of honor on the sofa nearest the fireplace. Lord Blackwood hovered near the door, barely containing his excitement. When the Duke entered, he carried a bouquet of late-season roses, their petals just beginning to fade at the edges. He presented them to Emilia with appropriate courtesy, inquired after her health, commented on the pleasant weather. All perfectly correct, all utterly distant. Then his gaze found Isabel in her corner. "Lady Isabel," he said, crossing to where she sat. "What are you reading?" She held up the book, a volume of Voltaire's philosophical essays that she'd discovered in her father's library. "Ambitious reading for an afternoon," the Duke observed, and she could have sworn she saw amusement in his eyes. "I find Voltaire's arguments about tolerance particularly relevant," Isabel said before she could stop herself, "though I disagree with some of his conclusions about natural philosophy." "Do you?" The Duke settled into the chair beside her corner, his attention entirely focused on her response. "In what way?" And just like that, they were deep in conversation about empiricism and rationalism, about the limits of human reason, about whether true knowledge could exist independent of experience. Across the room, Amelia sat with the roses in her lap, watching. Lord Blackwood frowned, uncertain how to redirect the Duke's attention without appearing rude. The visit lasted the appropriate 30 minutes. When the Duke took his leave, he bowed to Amelia, thanked Lord Blackwood for his hospitality, and told Isabel he looked forward to continuing their discussion. The moment his carriage disappeared down the drive, Lord Blackwood turned on Amelia. "You must engage him more. Ask him questions. Show interest in his conversation." "I tried, Father," Amelia said quietly. "He was speaking with Isabel." "Then you must speak louder. Be more charming." Isabel left the room before she could hear more, her book clutched against her chest, her mind spinning with confusion. The pattern repeated itself over the following 2 weeks. The Duke called every 3 days, always during proper hours, always with appropriate gifts, flowers, a book of poetry, a collection of botanical prints. He was unfailingly courteous to Amelia, attentive to Lord Blackwood, and scrupulously proper in all his conduct. But his conversations were always with Isabel. He asked about her reading. She asked about his work on educational reform. They debated the merits of various philosophers, discussed political theory, argued good-naturedly about whether poetry or prose better captured truth. Time disappeared when they spoke, the rest of the room fading until there was only the exchange of ideas, the thrill of being genuinely understood. Isabel began to anticipate his visits with a mixture of excitement and dread. Each conversation made the next separation more difficult. Each thoughtful question, each moment of intellectual connection, carved deeper into her carefully guarded heart. Amelia grew quieter with each visit, her perfect composure showing cracks like fine porcelain under pressure. She performed her role flawlessly, smiled at the right moments, offered tea with graceful hands, never showed anger or resentment. But Isabel saw the tightness around her sister's eyes, the way her shoulders tensed when the Duke turned his attention away from her. Lord Blackwood remained stubbornly oblivious, attributing the Duke's interest in Isabel to mere politeness. "He's being kind to your sister because she's here," he told Amelia after the 4th visit. "But you must work harder to capture his real attention. Be more vivacious. Laugh more. Show him what an excellent duchess you would make." Isabel wanted to scream at her father's blindness. But what would be the point? He saw what he needed to see, what the world had taught him to value. The 5th visit changed everything. The Duke arrived on a crisp afternoon when the autumn leaves were at their peak, the gardens ablaze with gold and crimson. After the usual pleasantries in the drawing room, he made an unexpected request. "The day is remarkably fine," he said, addressing Lord Blackwood. "Might I impose upon your hospitality and request a walk in your gardens? I've heard they're quite beautiful this time of year." Lord Blackwood nearly fell over himself, agreeing. "Of course, Your Grace." Amelia, accompany the Duke. "I was hoping," the Duke interrupted gently, "that both Lady Amelia and Lady Isabel might join me. I find the conversation flows more easily with a small group." It was an unusual request, but not improper. Lord Blackwood hesitated, then nodded. The 3 of them walked out into the garden, Amelia on the Duke's right arm, Isabel on his left, though she had not taken his offered arm, keeping a proper distance instead. They had barely reached the rose arbor when a maid appeared, breathless. "Lady Amelia, forgive me, but your mother requests your presence. She has need of your opinion on the menu for tomorrow's dinner." It was obviously contrived. Lady Blackwood had never consulted Amelia about menus in her life, but Amelia, reading the situation with the sharp intelligence she usually kept hidden, simply nodded. "Of course. Your Grace, Lady Isabel, please excuse me." She swept away, leaving Isabel alone with the Duke among the fading roses. Panic fluttered in Isabel's chest. This was improper. They should return to the house, find a chaperone, maintain the appropriate distance. Instead, They walked deeper into the garden. "Your Grace," Isabel said finally, unable to bear the silence, "I believe you are expected to court my sister." "Expected, yes." The Duke's voice was quiet, measured. "Expected by your father, by society, by everyone who sees only surfaces." "She is beautiful," Isabel said, defensive. "She is everything a duchess should be." "She is lovely," the Duke agreed. "She is accomplished and graceful and perfectly bred for the role, and when I speak with her, I feel nothing but a distant sort of appreciation, like admiring a portrait in a gallery." Isabel stopped walking, turning to face him. "Then why do you keep calling?" The Duke met her eyes, and she saw in them a vulnerability that made her breath catch. "I lost someone very dear to me, many years ago," he said carefully. "Catherine. She was brilliant and fierce and utterly herself, and when she died, I believed my capacity for connection died with her. I spent 8 years in a comfortable sort of numbness, managing my estates, fulfilling my obligations, feeling nothing." He paused, and Isabel saw him gathering courage. "But you," he continued, "you remind me that there are still minds worth knowing, souls worth discovering. When we speak, I feel alive again. Not because you resemble Catherine, you don't, not in any physical way, but because you're real, Isabel. You're genuinely, authentically yourself, and that is rarer than you can possibly imagine in the world we inhabit." Isabel's hands trembled. She clasped them together, trying to steady herself. "I am not my sister," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am not beautiful. I am not charming. I am not what society expects. I will embarrass you at dinners and balls. People will say you made a poor choice, that grief has clouded your judgment. Isabel." The Duke spoke her name like a prayer. "No, you are something far more rare than beautiful or charming. You are real, and I find I would rather spend my life in honest conversation with someone real than in elegant silence with someone perfect." The garden seemed to hold its breath around them. Fallen leaves crunched softly beneath their feet. The scent of late roses hung in the cooling air. "I don't know what to do with this," Isabel admitted, tears threatening. "I don't know how to want something this much without being terrified of losing it." "Then be terrified," the Duke said gently. "Be uncertain. Be yourself. That's all I ask." The sound of footsteps on gravel interrupted them. Lord Blackwood, probably, come to ensure propriety or to redirect the Duke's attention back to Amelia. The Duke stepped back, restoring proper distance. "I should return you to the house." They walked in silence, but everything had changed. Isabel felt it in the way the air moved around them. In the careful space the Duke maintained between them that somehow felt more intimate than touching. That night, Isabel stood at her bedroom window, watching the Duke's carriage disappear down the darkened drive. The lamp in his carriage cast a warm glow that faded into the darkness, and she pressed her palm against the cold glass. For 22 years, she had been invisible. For 22 years, she had told herself that invisibility was safety, that not being seen meant not being hurt. But now someone saw her, really saw her, and the terror of being seen warred with a desperate, dangerous hope. What if? The question hung in the darkness like a prayer. What if someone could love me not despite who I am, but because of it? Isabel rested her forehead against the window and let herself imagine a future she had never dared to dream. Chapter 5. Truths and Fractures. 3 weeks after the ball, Isabel woke to whispers. She had come downstairs early, seeking the quiet of the morning before the household fully stirred. When voices drifted from the servants' hall, the door left slightly ajar. Imagine, the Duke preferring the plain one. The voice belonged to Sarah, one of the newer maids. "My cousin works at the Pemberton estate, and she says all of society is talking about it. Perhaps his grief has addled his wits," another voice replied, older, more measured. 8 years is a long time to mourn. The mind can play tricks. Still, Lady Amelia must be devastated. To be passed over for her own sister. Isabel's hand tightened on the banister. She should move, should make her presence known, should do anything but stand frozen like a child eavesdropping on adult conversations. The plain one. The words echoed in her mind, reopening every wound she'd thought had scarred over. Of course, that's what they called her. Of course, that's how the world saw her, not as Isabel, not as a person with thoughts and feelings, but as the plain one, defined entirely by what she lacked in comparison to Amelia. And the Duke's interest? Explained away as madness, as grief-induced delusion, not as genuine attraction or intellectual connection, but as something wrong with him. Isabel turned and climbed the stairs back to her room. Her appetite for breakfast vanished. By afternoon, the whispers had apparently reached her father's ears. Isabel was in the small parlor, attempting to read, when Lord Blackwood's voice thundered from the doorway. "My study, now." She rose on unsteady legs and followed him, dread settling in her stomach like a stone. He closed the study door behind them with barely controlled force. "What have you done?" His face was flushed, his hands trembling with anger or panic or both. 3 weeks, Isabel. 3 weeks of the Duke calling, and only now do I understand what's been happening under my own roof. Father, you have been sabotaging your sister's future. He paced before his desk like a caged animal, deliberately engaging him in conversation, displaying your learning like some kind of blue-stocking, distracting him from the purpose of his visits. The purpose of his visits? Isabel's voice rose despite her intention to remain calm. He calls because he wishes to. He speaks with me because he chooses to. I have done nothing but answer his questions honestly. Honestly, Lord Blackwood spat the word. You will cease these intellectual displays immediately. When the Duke calls, you will remain silent. You will let Amelia shine as she should. You will remember your place in this family. Something inside Isabel cracked. 22 years of being overlooked, of being invisible, of never being quite enough, it all came pouring out. My place? She faced her father squarely, tears threatening but her voice steady. And what is my place, father? To sit quietly in corners, to make myself smaller so Amelia can appear larger. I have done nothing but be myself. Perhaps that is the problem. I have never been enough for this family. Lord Blackwood stared at her as though seeing a stranger. You are being hysterical. I am being honest, Isabel interrupted. For the first time in my life, someone sees me, actually sees me, not as Amelia's shadow, not as the disappointing second daughter, but as myself. And you cannot bear it, because it doesn't fit your plans. Our family is facing ruin. Lord Blackwood's voice cracked. Amelia must marry well. She must save us. You have no right to interfere. I have every right to exist, Isabel shouted, shocking them both. I have every right to be seen, to be wanted, to matter. The silence that followed was deafening. Isabel turned and fled before her father could respond, before the tears could fall, before she said something that would shatter their relationship beyond repair. She found refuge where she always did, in the library, in the worn leather chair by the window, surrounded by books that had been her companions when people failed her. The tears came then, hot and bitter. She pressed her face into her hands and let herself break. Let the pain of being the plain one, of being told she was sabotaging her sister's happiness simply by being herself, wash over her in waves. She didn't hear the door open, didn't notice she wasn't alone until a handkerchief appeared in her field of vision. Here, Amelia said softly. Isabel looked up, startled, to find her sister settling into the chair beside her. Amelia's perfect composure showed cracks, her eyes were red-rimmed, her hands twisting in her lap. I heard father shouting, Amelia said. Half the house heard him. I'm sorry, Isabel managed, wiping her eyes. I never meant to. Don't, Amelia's voice was firm. Don't apologize. Not for this. They sat in silence for a long moment, the afternoon light slanting through the dusty windows, illuminating the space between them. I have been jealous of you, Isabel, Amelia said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Isabel stared at her sister. Of me? You who have everything? Amelia laughed, but it was a broken sound. Everything? I have been a thing, Isabel. A beautiful thing, carefully maintained and displayed, but a thing nonetheless. You have always been free to be yourself, to read what you choose, to think what you wish, to exist without the weight of everyone's expectations crushing you. Free, Isabel echoed. I have been invisible. Yes, Amelia said, meeting her eyes. But invisible means unseen. I have been seen constantly, but never truly known. Do you understand the difference? Isabel saw tears tracking down her sister's perfect face, the first genuine emotion she'd witnessed from Amelia in years. 3 years ago, Amelia continued, her voice shaking, I fell desperately in love with Captain Thomas Ashford. He was the second son of a baronet, respectable, but with no title, no fortune. When father discovered our attachment, he forbade it immediately. Thomas left for India, and I. She pressed the handkerchief to her eyes. I have been dying slowly ever since. Every ball, every suitor, every performance of being the perfect daughter, it's been a kind of living death. Amelia, Isabel breathed, reaching for her sister's hand. "The Duke should choose you," Emilia said fiercely. "You make each other come alive. I see it when you speak together, the way you both lean forward, the way the rest of the room disappears. I see the way he looks at you, Isabel, and I wish," her voice broke, "I only wish someone would look at me that way. Not at my face, not at what I represent, but at me." Isabel squeezed her sister's hand, understanding flooding through her. They had both been trapped, one by beauty, one by its absence, one admired but unknown, one unseen but free to think. "I'm terrified," Isabel confessed. "What if I'm not enough? What if this is a fantasy that will shatter the moment he truly knows me?" Emilia turned to face her fully, gripping both of Isabel's hands. "What if it's real, and you let fear steal it from you? What if you finally have the chance to be seen and known and loved, and you run from it because you've been taught you don't deserve it?" The words hit Isabel like a physical blow. How many years had she told herself she didn't deserve to be seen? How deeply had she internalized the message that she was less than? "I received a letter last week," Emilia said, her voice softening. "From Thomas. He's returning to England in 2 months. He never married. He says he never stopped loving me." Isabel's breath caught. "What will you do?" "I don't know yet," Emilia admitted. "Father will be furious. But watching you with the Duke, watching you find the courage to be yourself despite everything, it's made me wonder if perhaps I deserve that too." The sisters embraced then, clinging to each other, finding in shared pain and shared hope a connection that had eluded them their entire lives. Emilia's tears soaked into Isabel's shoulder, and Isabel's into Emilia's, and for the first time they were not the beautiful one and the plain one, not rivals for attention or favor, but simply two women trying to find their way in a world that wanted to define them. When they finally pulled apart, Emilia wiped her eyes and managed a watery smile. "What will you do?" she asked. Isabel thought of the Duke, of their conversations, of the way he looked at her as though she mattered. She thought of her father's anger, society's judgment, all the voices telling her she wasn't enough, and she made her decision. "I will not hide any more," she said, her voice steady despite her fear. "And I will be honest with him, about everything. The Duke deserves to know the truth about our family's financial situation, about Father's desperation, about all of it. If his interest in me is real, it should survive honesty." Emilia nodded. "And if Father tries to stop you? Then I will finally stop being invisible by choice," Isabel said. "I have spent 22 years making myself small to fit into spaces that were never meant for me. No more." They sat together as the afternoon light faded, two sisters who had finally seen each other clearly, finding strength in solidarity. Outside the library, the household continued its anxious preparations, Lord Blackwood no doubt plotting how to salvage Emilia's prospects. But in the quiet sanctuary of books and dusty light, Isabel and Emilia made their own plans, plans that had nothing to do with what society expected and everything to do with what they deserved. For the first time in her life, Isabel felt the weight of invisibility lifting. It was terrifying, it was exhilarating, and she was finally ready. Chapter 6. The Offering and the Debt. The invitation arrived on thick cream paper, sealed with the Duke's crest in burgundy wax. Lord Blackwood read it 3 times before his hands stopped trembling. "The Duke of Ashworth requests the pleasure of the Blackwood family's company for tea at Ashworth Manor. This is it," he said, his voice tight with barely suppressed hope. "A formal invitation to his estate. He means to make an offer." Isabel, standing by the window with a book she wasn't reading, felt her stomach clench. She had resolved to tell the Duke the truth about their family's circumstances, but the weight of that decision pressed on her chest like a physical thing. Emilia, seated at her embroidery, met Isabel's eyes across the room. In that glance passed understanding, encouragement, and something that looked like pride. "We must make an excellent impression," Lord Blackwood continued, already planning. "Emilia, the lavender silk. Isabel." He paused, seeming to truly look at her for the first time in days. "Wear something appropriate." Isabel nodded, her throat too tight for words. Ashworth Manor in daylight was even more magnificent than it had been on the night of the ball. The autumn sun gilded the classical facade, and the formal gardens stretched in geometric perfection toward distant woods ablaze with color. They were received in a drawing room that spoke of wealth deployed with taste rather than ostentation. Wedgwood blue walls, furniture upholstered in cream damask, paintings that were genuine masterpieces rather than mere decoration. A tea service of delicate porcelain waited on a low table, and through the tall windows, the gardens beckoned. The Duke greeted them with his characteristic quiet courtesy, but his eyes found Isabel immediately and held there a moment longer than propriety strictly allowed. "Thank you for accepting my invitation," he said, gesturing for them to be seated. "I hope the journey wasn't too taxing." Lord Blackwood launched into effusive gratitude, his nervousness making him verbose. Emilia sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her expression serene. Isabel perched on the edge of her chair, her heart hammering against her ribs. Tea was poured. Pleasantries were exchanged. The Duke asked after their comfort, commented on the unusually fine weather, mentioned an upcoming exhibition at the Royal Academy. All perfectly normal, all utterly surreal. Then the Duke set down his cup and turned to Lord Blackwood. "Sir, I wonder if I might request a private word with Lady Isabel. There is a matter I wish to discuss with her." The silence that followed was deafening. Lord Blackwood's cup rattled slightly in its saucer. Emilia's eyes widened fractionally before her composure reasserted itself. "Your Grace, that would be highly irregular," Lord Blackwood managed. "I am aware," the Duke said calmly. "Nevertheless, I ask your permission." It wasn't really a request, not from a Duke. Lord Blackwood swallowed hard and nodded. The Duke rose and offered Isabel his hand. She took it, feeling the warmth of his palm through her glove, and followed him from the drawing-room. His study was magnificent, a cathedral to learning. Books lined every wall from floor to ceiling, their leather spines gleaming in the autumn light that streamed through windows overlooking the gardens. The scent of leather and paper and old wood filled the air, and Isabel felt something in her chest loosen despite her anxiety. "Your library," she breathed. "One of the few rooms in this house that feels genuinely mine," the Duke said, closing the door behind them. Not completely leaving it slightly ajar for propriety, but enough to create intimacy. They stood facing each other in the center of the room, and Isabel summoned every ounce of courage she possessed. "Your Grace, there is something you must know," she said before he could speak. "Before you say anything, before this goes any further, I cannot in good conscience allow you to continue in ignorance." He waited, his expression attentive but not alarmed. The words tumbled out in a rush. "My father is facing financial ruin, complete ruin. Our family has approximately 4 months before we lose everything, the estate, the income, all of it. The only thing that will remain is the title, which is worth nothing without the means to support it." She took a shaking breath. "You should know this, because if you are considering any future association with our family, you deserve the truth. I will not have you discover later that you were deceived." The Duke's expression didn't change. He simply watched her with those dark, assessing eyes. "I know," he said quietly. Isabel's world tilted. "You know? I make it my business to know the circumstances of anyone I might ally myself with," the Duke said, taking a step closer. "I learned of your family's situation before I ever attended that ball." "Then why?" Isabel couldn't finish the question. Her mind spun with implications. The Duke moved closer still, near enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the slight imperfection where an old scar marked his left eyebrow. "Because financial circumstances have nothing to do with the worth of a person's mind, heart, or soul," he said, his voice low and intense. "I did not come to that ball seeking a transaction, Lady Isabel. I came because I have been alone for 8 years, and I was weary of loneliness. I came hoping to find, I don't know what I was hoping for, but I found you." Isabel's hands trembled. She clasped them together to still them. "But I will not court you under false pretenses," the Duke continued. "I want to help your family not as payment for your hand, not as leverage or obligation, but because it is within my power to do so, and because your father's desperation has trapped both his daughters in cages they didn't build. I cannot let you solve our problems," Isabel said, her voice breaking. "It wouldn't be right. It would mean I came to you because of money, because of necessity." "Then don't let me," the Duke interrupted gently. "Let me solve them for Emilia's sake, for your mother's sake, for the servants who would lose their positions. What happens between us should be separate from financial obligation. I want your choice to be free, Isabel, genuinely free." No one had ever offered her freedom before. The concept was so foreign that she couldn't quite grasp it. "Free," she echoed. "I am not proposing," the Duke said, and she heard vulnerability in his voice. "Not yet. I am asking if you would allow me to court you properly." with no debts between us, no obligations, no pressure, just possibility. Just two people discovering whether what we found in conversation might grow into something more. The study was very quiet. Through the windows, Isabel could see gardeners working in the distance, autumn leaves drifting down like golden rain. The world continued, oblivious to the fact that her entire life was reordering itself in this moment. "I am terrified," she whispered. "I know," the Duke said. "So am I. What if I'm not enough? What if society's judgment proves too much? What if—" "Isabel," he spoke her name like a benediction. "What if you are exactly enough? What if this terrifying thing is real?" She looked up into his face and saw her own fear reflected there, her own desperate hope, and she understood then that vulnerability was not weakness, it was the only honest foundation on which anything real could be built. "Yes," she said, "I am terrified, but yes." The Duke's expression transformed relief and joy, and something deeper that made her breath catch. He didn't touch her beyond what propriety allowed, but the space between them felt charged, alive with possibility. "Then let me speak with your father," he said. "Let me settle the debts as a gesture of goodwill, and then, if you're willing, let me court you properly." Isabel nodded, not trusting her voice. They returned to the drawing room, where Lord Blackwood and Amelia waited in tense silence. The Duke resumed his seat and finished his tea, speaking of inconsequential things, before requesting a private word with Lord Blackwood in his study. Isabel watched them go, then met Amelia's questioning gaze. "He knows," Isabel mouthed, "about everything." Amelia's eyes widened, but before she could respond, the men returned. Lord Blackwood's face was pale, his expression stunned. "We should take our leave," he said, his voice unsteady. "Your Grace, your generosity is—" "I cannot adequately express." The Duke bowed. "I am pleased to be of service." As they prepared to depart, the Duke caught Isabel's hand briefly, a touch so fleeting it might have been accidental, but his eyes held hers. "I will call on Thursday," he said quietly. "If that would be acceptable." "Yes," Isabel managed. "That would be acceptable." The carriage ride home passed in near silence. Lord Blackwood stared out the window, his mind clearly racing. Amelia held Isabel's hand, squeezing gently. That evening, as Isabel prepared for bed, she heard footsteps in the corridor outside her room. They paused at her door. She waited, holding her breath, but no knock came. After a long moment, the footsteps retreated. Lord Blackwood had stood outside his younger daughter's door, the daughter he had overlooked and dismissed, the daughter who had accomplished what his perfect daughter could not, and found himself unable to speak, unable to apologize, unable to acknowledge, unable to reconcile the Isabel he had always ignored with the Isabel who had captured a duke's genuine affection. His reckoning was not yet complete, but in her room, Isabel stood at the window, looking out at the star-scattered sky, and felt the weight of invisibility finally, completely lifting. She was seen, she was chosen, she was free, and the terror of it was matched only by the exhilarating, breathtaking joy. Chapter 7. Society's Judgment. The news spread through London society like ink bleeding through paper unstoppable, staining everything it touched. The Duke of Ashworth is courting the younger Blackwood sister, not the beautiful one, the plain one. Isabel first heard the whispers during a fitting at the Modiste, where Madame Devereux's assistants spoke in voices they thought were too low to carry. Imagine choosing her over Lady Amelia. Perhaps grief truly has damaged his faculties. She pretended not to hear, standing perfectly still while pins were adjusted, her face carefully blank. But each word was a needle, finding its mark. By the time Lady Hartfield's garden party arrived 3 days later, the gossip had reached a fever pitch. Isabel had considered feigning illness to avoid attending, but Amelia had taken her hand that morning and said simply, "We face them together." So Isabel, dressed in a gown of soft blue, not grey this time, not invisible, and went to face society's judgment. The Hartfield estate gardens were magnificent in the autumn afternoon, all golden light and precisely manicured hedges. Ladies in their finest gowns clustered like exotic birds beneath silk canopies, while gentlemen stood in groups discussing politics and horses. Servants circulated with champagne and delicate pastries. It should have been beautiful. Instead, it felt like stepping into an arena. The whispers started the moment Isabel and Amelia descended from their carriage. Not even whispers, really conversations held at volumes, clearly meant to be overheard. The plain sister ensnared him somehow. A woman in peacock blue said to her companion, her voice carrying across the lawn. Perhaps she used some art. Women have ways, you know. I heard the Duke's judgment must be impaired by grief, another replied. 8 years of mourning would disorder anyone's mind. Isabel felt each word like a physical blow, but she kept her chin high, her hand steady on Emilia's arm. They moved through the garden, accepting greetings that ranged from genuinely warm to coldly perfunctory, navigating a social battlefield where every smile might conceal a blade. Then Lady Pemberton materialized before them. She was a formidable woman in her 60s, a society matriarch whose approval or disapproval could make or break a debutante season. Her steel-grey gown matched her eyes, and her expression combined pity with something sharper. "Lady Isabel," she said, her voice honey-sweet and venomous, "might I have a word?" It wasn't really a request. Emilia's hand tightened on Isabel's arm, but Isabel gently extracted herself and followed Lady Pemberton to a slightly more private corner of the garden. "My dear," Lady Pemberton began, her tone suggesting she was bestowing great wisdom, "I feel it is my duty to speak plainly to you. This attachment between yourself and the Duke, it is quite unfortunate." "Unfortunate," Isabel repeated, her voice carefully neutral. "You must know you are quite out of your depth," Lady Pemberton continued, her eyes cold despite her sympathetic expression. "The Duke requires a wife who can represent his position with grace and beauty, someone who can shine at state dinners, who can navigate the highest circles of society without embarrassment. Surely, you see, you are not suited to such a role." The words were delivered with surgical precision, designed to cut through whatever fragile confidence Isabel had built, and they worked. Isabel felt her carefully constructed composure cracking, felt the old familiar shame rising like a tide. "Lady Pemberton," she began, but her voice wavered. "My sister," Emilia said, appearing at Isabel's side like an avenging angel, "possesses more grace in her smallest gesture than most women achieve in a lifetime. The Duke's judgment is impeccable, it is society's that I question." The pronouncement rang across the garden, conversations stuttered to a halt, heads turned. Lady Pemberton's expression froze in shock. "Lady Emilia, surely you cannot—" "I can and I do," Emilia said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent her life as society's darling and no longer cared to maintain that position. "My sister has been overlooked her entire life by people too shallow to see past surfaces. If the Duke is wise enough to recognize her worth, then he is a better judge of character than anyone present." She turned to Isabel, whose eyes were swimming with tears. "Come, the air here has grown stale." They walked away together, leaving Lady Pemberton speechless and society buzzing with this new development. But Isabel made it only to the edge of the garden, to a secluded path lined with late-blooming roses, before she broke. "I cannot do this," she gasped, pressing her hands to her face. "Emilia, they are right. I am not beautiful enough, not polished enough. I will embarrass him. I will be a liability. He should choose someone else." "Isabel," the Duke's voice cut through her spiral. She looked up to find him standing a few feet away, his expression concerned, intense. Emilia, reading the situation with her usual acuity, melted away down the path, leaving them alone in the sheltering shade of the rose arbor. "What has happened?" the Duke asked, closing the distance between them. "They are saying terrible things," Isabel said, her voice breaking. "That you are mad, that I have trapped you somehow, that I am completely unsuited to be your wife. Look at me, Isabel." It was the first time he had used her given name. The intimacy of it made her breath catch. She met his eyes dark, steady, certain. "I have spent 8 years in a tomb of grief," he said, his voice low and fierce, surrounded by society's most beautiful women, feeling nothing but a distant sort of numbness. "You brought me back to life. Do you think I care what Lady Pemberton thinks?" "But I care," Isabel cried. "I cannot bear to be the object of mockery, to have people whisper that you made a poor choice, that grief damaged your judgment." "Then we will prove them wrong," the Duke said, stepping closer, his hands moving to grip her arms gently, steadying her. "Together. But I need to know, Isabel, are you rejecting me because of your own doubts, or because of their judgment?" The question cut to the heart of everything. Isabel stared up at him, tears streaming down her face, and was forced to confront her deepest fear. Was she running because she genuinely believed she wasn't enough? Or because she had spent so long being told she wasn't enough that she could no longer distinguish her own voice from society's? "I am afraid," she whispered. I am afraid I will wake up and discover this was a dream, that I am still invisible, still overlooked, still the disappointing daughter who never quite measured up. I am afraid that one day you will look at me and see what everyone else sees, the plain one, the forgettable one, and wonder what you were thinking." The Duke's expression softened. One hand moved from her arm to cup her face, his thumb brushing away tears. "You have never been invisible to me," he said. "From the moment I saw you at that ball, reading Wollstonecraft, genuinely absorbed in ideas rather than performing for an audience, I saw you. I see you still. I see a woman of remarkable intelligence, fierce honesty, and a depth of character that makes every other woman I've met seem like shadows on a wall." "They will never accept me," Isabel said, but her voice was weakening. "Some will," the Duke countered. "Some already do. And those who don't, their opinions matter less to me than one honest conversation with you." He paused, his eyes searching hers. "I do not want to be invisible anymore. I want to be seen by you, even if society disapproves." "Then stand with me," the Duke said. "Let them whisper. Let them judge. We will build something real, something that doesn't require their approval to exist. But I need you to choose this, Isabel, not out of duty or desperation, but because you want it." Isabel looked up at this man who saw her, truly saw her, who had offered her freedom and then stood firm when she was most afraid. She thought of 22 years of invisibility, of making herself small, of accepting that she was less than, and she chose differently. "I do not want to be invisible anymore," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I want to be seen, by you, by myself, even if society disapproves, even if they whisper, even if they never accept me. I want to try. I want this." The Duke smiled, that genuine smile that transformed his grief-marked face into something beautiful. "Then let us return to the party," he said, offering his arm. "Together." Isabel took his arm, feeling the solid warmth of him beside her, and they walked back down the rose-lined path toward the garden party and its judging eyes. The whispers rose like a wave when they appeared, Isabel's hand on the Duke's arm, his posture protective, both their expressions resolute. Lady Pemberton's face went through several fascinating transformations. Other guests stared openly, but Amelia was there, smiling with fierce pride. And a few faces, the Duchess of Marlborough, old Lord Hartfield, Lady Sarah Whitmore, showed not judgment but approval. Isabel held her head high and did not let go of the Duke's arm. That evening, as Isabel prepared for bed, a soft knock sounded at her door. "Come in," she called, expecting Amelia. Instead, Lord Blackwood entered, looking older and more uncertain than she had ever seen him. "Father," Isabel said, surprised. He stood in the doorway, struggling visibly with words that clearly didn't come easily. "I have failed you as a father," he said finally, his voice rough. "I saw only what society valued and missed what truly mattered. For 22 years, I looked past you, dismissed you, treated you as though you were somehow less than your sister. I cannot undo those years. I cannot give you back what I took through my blindness." Isabel's throat tightened. "But I see you now," Lord Blackwood continued. "And I am proud of your courage, proud of the woman you have become, despite my failures. You have more strength than I ever recognized. It wasn't a complete redemption. Years of hurt couldn't be erased with one conversation. But it was a beginning, an acknowledgement, an apology, a tentative step towards something better." "Thank you, Father," Isabel said softly. He nodded, unable to say more, and withdrew. Isabel stood alone in her room, looking at her reflection in the mirror, the same face she had always had, unremarkable, ordinary, not the face society celebrated, but seen, chosen, valued. She smiled at her reflection and finally, for the first time in her life, liked what she saw. Chapter 8. The Gala and the Declaration. 4 weeks had passed since the garden party, and Isabel had spent them learning what it meant to be courted properly. There had been walks in the park, with Amelia accompanying as chaperone, where she and the Duke discussed everything from political philosophy to their favorite novels. Dinners at both estates, where conversation flowed easily despite Lord Blackwood's lingering nervousness. Afternoons in the Duke's magnificent library, where he had given her free rein to explore his collection, and they had debated the merits of various authors until the light faded. She had grown more confident with each passing day, more certain that this was real, that she was genuinely wanted. But tonight was the ultimate test. The Duke's Gala was the event of the season. Every person of consequence in London society would be there, watching, judging, waiting to see what the Duke would do. Isabel stood before her mirror as Emilia fastened the last button on her gown, deep sapphire silk, that they had chosen together, elegant and understated, honoring Isabel's own style rather than trying to compete with conventional beauty. "You look magnificent," Emilia said, stepping back to admire her work. "Not because of the gown, though it's lovely, because you look like yourself, confident, ready." Isabel met her sister's eyes in the mirror. "I'm terrified." "Good," Emilia said, smiling. "That means it matters." A knock at the door interrupted them. Lord Blackwood's voice tentative. "The carriage is ready when you are." In the month since his halting apology, her father had been carefully, awkwardly trying to repair what he had broken. He asked about her reading now. He looked at her when he spoke. It wasn't enough to erase 22 years, but it was something. "We're coming, father," Isabel called. Emilia squeezed her hand. "Tonight, you step fully into the light. No more shadows." Isabel took a deep breath and nodded. Ashworth Manor blazed with light, every window golden, the drive lined with torches that turned the approaching carriages into a procession of fire. The sound of music and laughter drifted across the grounds, and Isabel felt her heart hammering against her ribs. The weight of hundreds of eyes found her the moment she entered the ballroom. She had expected it, had prepared for it, but the reality still stole her breath. Society's elite turned to observe the Blackwood family's entrance, conversations pausing mid-sentence, fans stilling mid-flutter. The whispers began immediately, not cruel now, but curious, speculative. The Duke's choice. The plain sister, the one who somehow captured him. Then the Duke was there, crossing the ballroom with purpose, his eyes finding Isabel immediately, as though everyone else had ceased to exist. "Lady Isabel," he said, bowing formally. "Lady Emilia, Lord Blackwood, welcome." His greeting was proper, appropriate, but his gaze held Isabel's a moment longer than strictly necessary, and she saw in his eyes everything he couldn't say in public. "You're here. You came. You're magnificent." The evening progressed in a blur of introductions and conversations. Isabel navigated the social waters with growing confidence, no longer trying to disappear into corners. Some guests remained cool, disapproving. Others were curious, asking thoughtful questions, genuinely interested in this woman who had captured the Duke's heart. A few were openly supportive. The Duchess of Marlborough, ancient, formidable, respected by all, approached Isabel during a lull in conversation. "My dear," she said, her voice carrying the authority of 8 decades of navigating society, "I have watched the Duke for 8 years. I knew his Catherine, wonderful girl, taken far too soon. I have watched him grieve, watched him withdraw, watched countless beautiful women try and fail to breach his defenses." Isabel held her breath. "You have given him back his life," the Duchess continued. "Anyone who cannot see your value is a fool. I expect you to call on me next week. We have much to discuss." It was an endorsement, a public declaration of approval from one of society's most influential figures. Isabel felt something tight in her chest loosen. "Thank you, Your Grace," she managed. The Duchess patted her arm. "Stand firm, child. You're stronger than you know." The moment came as the clock struck 10. The Duke crossed the ballroom, the crowd parting before him, and stopped in front of Isabel. The music had paused between sets. The entire room fell silent. "Lady Isabel," he said, his voice carrying in the sudden quiet, "would you do me the honor of this dance?" It was the question everyone had been waiting for. Isabel's hand trembled slightly as she placed it in his. "Yes," she said clearly, "I would be honored." The orchestra began a waltz, something sweeping and romantic, that filled the ballroom with sound. But as the Duke led Isabel onto the floor, as his hand settled at her waist and hers on his shoulder, the music faded to background noise. The world narrowed to just the two of them. They moved together, turning in perfect synchronization, and Isabel forgot to be nervous, forgot the watching eyes, forgot everything except the man before her. "I see you, Lady Isabel," the Duke said quietly. His voice meant only for her. "Not as the sister in the shadows, but as yourself, as the woman who challenged me, who made me want to live again, who brought light back into my carefully guarded heart." Isabel felt tears threatening but kept them at bay through sheer will. "I have spent my life invisible," she said, finding her voice, finding her courage. "But you taught me that I was not invisible. I was simply waiting to be seen by the right eyes." The Duke's expression softened, transformed. "Will you marry me, Isabel?" he asked, the words carrying the weight of everything they had built together. Will you stand beside me, not as an ornament, but as a partner? Will you challenge me, debate with me, build a life of substance with me? The ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Isabel looked up at this man who saw her, truly saw her, who had offered her not just love but freedom, partnership, genuine equality. Yes, she said, her voice clear and certain, no longer afraid. I choose myself, and I choose you. The Duke smiled that genuine, transformative smile, and produced a ring from his pocket, simple, elegant, with a sapphire the exact color of her gown, set in delicate gold. He slipped it onto her finger as they continued to dance, and the ballroom erupted. Applause thundered through the space, even from those who had disapproved, even from those who had whispered cruel things. Because the Duke's happiness was undeniable, Isabel's courage was evident, and love, when it was this real, was impossible to dismiss. They finished the dance as an engaged couple, and Isabel felt like she was floating. Then, as the music ended and they stepped apart, a commotion rippled through the crowd near the entrance. A man stood there tall, sun-bronzed, dressed in traveling clothes that spoke of hasty arrival. His eyes swept the ballroom and locked immediately on one person, Emilia. Captain Thomas Ashford had come home. Isabel watched her sister's face transform, every carefully maintained mask shattering to reveal pure, overwhelming joy. Emilia moved across the ballroom like a woman in a dream, and the captain met her halfway, taking her hands, saying something Isabel couldn't hear but could read in every line of his body. I never stopped loving you. The Duke leaned close to Isabel. I tracked him down 3 weeks ago, he whispered, sent a letter explaining the situation. He was already booking passage home when my letter arrived. He'd been planning to return for months, gathering the courage to win her back. Isabel looked up at her fiancé with wonder. You did this? Every love story deserves a chance, he said simply. Across the room, Lord Blackwood watched both his daughters, one newly engaged to a duke, one reunited with her lost love, and Isabel saw understanding finally dawn on his face. The cost of his blindness, the years wasted trying to force his daughters into shapes that didn't fit them, the happiness he had nearly destroyed through narrow vision. He met Isabel's eyes across the ballroom and nodded, not forgiveness earned, but acknowledgement given. The gala continued, but now 2 love stories were blooming amid the music and champagne and society's fascinated whispers. Later, when the crowd had thinned slightly and the initial excitement had settled, Isabel and the Duke slipped away to the terrace. The autumn night was crisp and clear, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds. The gardens stretched before them in geometric beauty, and the sounds of the gala drifted through the open doors behind them, distant, unimportant. I was so afraid, Isabel said quietly, looking out over the grounds. Afraid I wasn't enough. Afraid this was all a dream that would shatter. The Duke took her hand, his thumb brushing over the sapphire ring. You were always enough. You simply needed to believe it yourself. Isabel turned to face him. This man who had seen her when she was invisible, who had valued her mind as much as any other quality, who had offered her partnership instead of ownership. I believe it now, she said. Finally, they stood together in the starlight, hand in hand, the future stretching before them like an unwritten book. Inside, Emilia danced with her captain. Lord Blackwood wrestled with his conscience, and society revised its opinions with the fickleness of those who follow rather than lead. But out here, in the quiet darkness, Isabel felt the final chains of invisibility fall away. She was no longer the overlooked sister, the plain one, the disappointing daughter. She had stepped into the light, not by changing who she was, but by finally valuing who she had always been, intelligent, passionate, real. The Duke pulled her closer, propriety forgotten in the privacy of the terrace. What are you thinking? He asked. Isabel smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes and transformed her unremarkable features into something beautiful. I'm thinking, she said, that I spent 22 years invisible, and it took only one person truly seeing me to change everything. I'm thinking that love is not about being perfect, it's about being seen, wholly and honestly, and being loved anyway. I'm thinking that I am exactly enough. The Duke kissed her forehead gently. More than enough. They remained on the terrace as the stars wheeled overhead, 2 people who had found each other against all expectation, who had built something real in a world of performances, who had chosen authenticity over approval. Inside, the gala continued. Outside, in the quiet night, Isabel Blackwood, soon to be Isabel Sinclair, Duchess of Ashworth stood in the light at last, no longer invisible, no longer afraid, finally, beautifully, completely herself. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. And so, dear listeners, Isabel Blackwood stepped out of the shadows and into a love that saw her true worth. Sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about being chosen despite our flaws. They're about being cherished because of our authentic selves. If this story touched your heart, please show your support by hitting that like button. It helps more people discover these tales of hope and unexpected romance. Subscribe to Lyra's Romance Stories and ring the notification bell so you never miss our next journey into love, courage, and happy endings. What did you think of Isabel and the Duke's story? Have you ever felt invisible, only to be truly seen by someone special? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and I love hearing how these stories resonate with you. And if you're craving more historical romance with strong heroines who refuse to be defined by society's expectations, check out the story in the card above. You'll love it. Until our next story, remember, you are not invisible. You are simply waiting to be seen by the right eyes. And when that moment comes, have the courage to step into the light. This is Lyra, reminding you that true love sees the soul, not just the surface. Sweet dreams, and I'll see you in the next story.